say that there's a long-lasting legacy, not only in Cuba, but also globally. And I have to say that the situation in Cuba today is so disastrous that this idea of sort of, I don't think people are very capable of idealizing revolutionary leaders in Cuba right now, just because the situation is so disastrous. But I think there are a couple of things in terms of Che Guevara's long-term legacy that will outlive the current crisis in Cuba and that is global, have to do with a kind of a, during much of the 20th century, socialism was associated with the Soviet Union, and then later in the second half of the 20th century, also with China, and with the construction of really big authoritarian, corrupt bureaucracies with horrific human rights violations and famines, humanly caused famines. And of course, these are not the first or the only humanly caused famines in world history. There have been many caused by capitalism, but it's hard to idealize socialism or communism when you see it causing famines and repression. And the Cuban Revolution as a whole, but I think globally, in a lot of ways, Che Guevara came to symbolize the Cuban Revolution for many people in Africa, elsewhere in Latin America, Asia. He really led the internationalist branch of the Cuban revolutionary policy, the idea of the tricontinental alliance of formerly colonized people and colonies struggling for liberation in Africa, in Latin America, in Asia, and to be this sort of alternative path and alternative voice in the world to unite for their liberation in a critique of all of the horrors caused by capitalism, but with a kind of a new vision of socialism. So like one of his legacies is this idea of the tricontinental and the internationalism and international solidarity. And Cuba as this, tiny little nothing country playing such a huge role in liberation struggles around the world. So for colonized people, that's really powerful. Another is the concept of the new man, el hombre nuevo, the idea that capitalism fosters greed and a lot of things that people will say, oh, well, that's just human nature, are actually the result of capitalism, not of human nature. And that socialism is not just about creating a different economic system or, finding ways to industrialize. Poor countries can industrialize, but it's about creating a new man, a new humanity that is inspired not by greed and self-promotion, but by being part of creating a just society. And I think that idea of the new man was also really inspirational, both in Cuba and around the world. And then growing out of both of those, the idea that poor countries, colonized countries, can from the bottom up mobilize the population to create something totally new. And that socialism is not just about top-down bureaucracies. Socialism is about building a new society from the bottom up. So I think in all of those ways, the global and lasting impact of Che Guevara is something that is not going to disappear. And there's a hospital in Cuba, the 24th of October hospital in Havana, that has a big, Che was a medical doctor, and it has a big billboard up on top of the hospital. And I had one of my students take a photo of it, and I put a photo in I've written 2 books. One is like an anthology called The Cuba Reader, History, Culture, Politics. It's a really giant book of mostly primary sources. And one is a much shorter little text called History of the Cuban Revolution. But I think I have this photo in both of the books. But it has a quote from Che Guevara, and he says, "A single human life is worth millions of times more than all of the properties of the richest man on the planet. And, you know, that kind of stirring phrase, that critique of capitalism, and that idea that humans do not have to, that humans can be something more expansive and more liberated than what capitalism offers us, I think is really powerful to a lot of people.